Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our final installment of You're Leaving Again. As Trish said, my name is Laura Zabriskie. I'm your USO host. And today we have such an exciting topic because I think it's often overlooked, but so crucial for your relationship, especially after you've spent some time apart. And that is casting vision for your future and creating that new normal, especially after you've been apart. Corie and Matt are going to talk us through what they've been doing since their most recent deployment that they've just endured together, as well as some tips and tricks from previous deployments, and then kind of what they've seen in the community that works really well. You know, as you're doing life together as a couple and as a family, you really want to be having these conversations to plan out what you really want your future to look like. So I'm so excited that Corie and Matt are going to be sharing some of that with us. And like usual, we have about an hour for the content, about 30 minutes to do some Q&A. We have a lot of great questions that came in through the registration that we'll try to get to. And then as Trish mentioned, don't forget to use that Q&A chat box feature for any questions that might come up during the event. With that, a very warm USO welcome to Corie and Matt Weathers. Thank you both for joining us today, as always. And I'll hop into the chat box and I will see you later.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for putting in the chat box where you guys are watching from. I'd love to know if you guys have been at any of the other webinars that we've done. This is our last one of the series, which is crazy to me. You're looking up the caveat, aren't you? Yep. He always remembers at the last minute. We're just so excited to spend some time with you guys. This has been an amazing series. I'd love to know in the chat box if you guys have watched any of the other videos. I'm sure we're going to be referencing some of those. But just a quick intro, if you're just joining us for the first time, my name is Corie Weathers, obviously a military spouse. I'm a clinician that works with military and first responder couples. And my husband here is a chaplain. Would you like to?
Hi, Matt Weathers, U.S. Army chaplain. And I wanted to let you know the views expressed are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the United States government.
There you go. There you have it. Okay. So I see Emily has already said she has not seen the other videos. And if others are watching that have not been a part of as well, just a really quick recap on what we've been doing. And I'll make this very brief because we have some great things to get to tonight. Is that the USO followed Matt and I during his deployment. That was about 5-6 months long.
162 days.
There you go.
Yeah.
And we just really wanted to allow the USO to kind of follow us and do these monthly webinars to kind of highlight what it's actually like for a couple and a family to go through that time apart. And we know, because we've been through a deployment before, that there's all of these stressors that happen for you as a couple, whether it's deployment or whether it's TDY or whether you might be making the choice to geobatch. And this military lifestyle asks us to spend time apart. And that's really stressful on a marriage, stressful on a marriage or on a family. And so we really wanted to be authentic and real and kind of share the ups and downs of our experience so that hopefully it would validate your experiences. And so each month we have done kind of a different topic as it relates to what we were going through, but also what we know you guys might be going through, and kind of just opening things up a little bit and having a authentic dialogue about this thing that we all go through in a really real way. You should have also gotten a PDF, a listening guide to go with this webinar. We did that for each of the webinars throughout the series. If after, I'm going to answer this again later. Thank you, Laura, for going ahead and putting the link up there. You can go back and watch the other videos on that link. And you also have access to the audio of those on my podcast. You'll also find that on the dashboard there. But we've covered topics like ripping the Band-Aid and all that stress that happens before you say goodbye. We talked about trying to figure out how to get on missions separately during that deployment and together. We talked about holidays. How do you navigate holidays as a couple? We've talked about parenting. We've talked about communication. We touched on intimacy while you're apart. Let's see, we talked about you coming Healing deep wounds. That's usually a very big topic, a hard topic, but a big one. So we touched on that. And then we also last month touched on reintegration. And I believe we did that shortly after you came back, within a week or two,
Yeah.
and covered kind of the stressors that happen during reintegration and tried to be really real with that. So tonight we are going to talk about kind of right after that reintegration. And I think, like Laura said, that's not really something that we usually talk about. We kind of just stop at reintegration, assume everything is great. And then it's almost like you ramp up again for that next time apart, or you try to find this new normal. And I feel like that's kind of all that's really out there as far as resources for us, is just like this, well, find your new normal and kind of figure it out as you go, and hope that everything just works out. But what I think you and I have seen, you know, and also seen in other families, is that when the longer of time you've spent apart, or if you're going through rapid cycling of deployments, what usually happens, what we've found for our military couples, is that it's very tempting and very easy to find yourselves adopting these very parallel paths. You know, you've kind of figured out what works for you during deployment. You figure out what works for you during deployment. And if your marriage gets to a place where you are not really learning how to reintegrate and cross those paths again, after a while, maybe just out of sheer weariness of being a military family, I've heard couples say, you know, maybe it's just easier if we just kind of keep on these parallel paths than try to figure out how to intersect them again. And that makes me super sad when I work with a couple that's gotten to that place. And there's still hope for you if that's where you're at, if you've kind of just thrown your hands up and just said, you know what, spouses, I'm going to run the household, and I'm going to just take charge and have control over all of that there. And service members are going to do their job. And we're just going to keep doing that because it's just easier to keep it that way. There's hope for your relationship to learn how to reintegrate that, but also how to cast vision for where to go with your relationship from there. So that's what tonight is about. Anything?
No, it was a whole lot.
Okay. Vision casting for tonight is what I wanted to do. So we wanted to start off by giving you guys a little bit of an update as far as what our post reintegration, kind of going into new normal, is like. And so I'm going to let you go first because I did so much talking. What has it been like for you as we've kind of got through that initial honeymoon stage of reintegration, and then kind of trying to figure out how to kind of cross our paths and figure out the new path ahead?
So since last time, because the last time we did the seminar, did the video, I had not gotten back to work yet. And so I went back to work about a week after that, about 5 days after we did the last one. And so since then, it's been a month of actually just trying to balance being back at work full time in that schedule, and then also being back at home, trying to plug in, connect with you, connect with the boys, do little things around the house and help. So it's been, it's a common experience of when you're on deployment, everything is like face forward. You're looking at the mission, you're taking care of that. And you kind of know that you'll be able to plug in as much as possible, but you really feel most of your responsibility lies in that direction. Coming back, there's that much more responsibility to be plugged in everywhere and to try and be great at everything. And that's I hear from a lot of service members of trying to go, okay, I'm trying to do this, trying to do that. And I just feel overwhelmed in all areas because you're trying to give your best, your creative best, your planning best. And so sometimes what you're giving your best at work, you know, planning and scheduling and making things happen, and being very kind of directive on that. Sometimes that bleeds over into the family. And so then you have to figure out, okay, wait a minute, how I related to people on a deployment and at work doesn't necessarily work when I actually come home to the family, because you're just in that mode of going and going and going. So you don't really, you know, unless you get that leave, you don't really get that chance to take a break, to actually pump the brakes. You're actually increasing responsibility, because the responsibilities don't stop at work. You're increasing the responsibility when you are then adding home and you know, routines and schedules and how people are doing and all those extra little things that you didn't have to worry about. You know, it's like, I think I read a meme once that said, I didn't know that adulthood was just planning dinner every night. And that's overwhelming. Like, oh no, what do we got to do dinner again. Oh no, again. Right. And so, you know, when you're deployed, all your meals are like figured out for you. So like, there is a part of my brain, don't need that. Right.
It contributes
I can
to
devote that to something else.
It contributes to the level of exhaustion
Mhm.
because I think
Oh, yeah.
that watching
What do you mean,
you,
planning dinner
yeah,
every
well,
night?
yeah.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Jeez.
I think that I watched you come home and try to be so intentional with everybody and everything.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like a whole lot of adulting.
Yeah.
Like it's just so much adulting on everybody's part. And I think that all that it's something we've been talking about a lot lately, is just all the adulting, all of the decisions, all of the intentionality, all of the trying to do the best that you can be really exhausting after a while. And that definitely contributes to that reintegration.
Well, this deployment asked more of you and the boys than it did of me. I mean, I was busy, but it wasn't, as emotionally taxing as other deployments have been. And so coming home and seeing where you guys were, I really wanted to lean in as much as possible. But then, we just kept having, it's been a month of, attempting to balance teenagers, which, bring their own whole set of things. And, in full transparency, being a military couple that has PCS'd 7 times, last year was our 7th PCS in 9 years. And so the last month really has been focused on our boys, because we've seen the impact that not having stabilized community has had on them. And so as much as we wanted to connect and go, hey, are we cool? And we're, back and doing life together and in one another's presence, almost at every point along the way, we've had to really lean in with the boys and go, okay, hey, we're gonna go out. No, they have something, they have a need.
Yeah. And
it's been difficult on that.
Yeah. Let me respond to that. So first of all, he's right. And I did want to share, and I've shared this in the previous videos, but just kind of in hindsight, because that's a little bit of what we're doing tonight is hindsight and then kind of thinking forward. And it was surprising for me to be the one that really struggled the most during the deployment. I was not prepared for that at all. I figured, I'm not the one that's changing scenery, changing location, changing much at all. In fact, in the middle of COVID, we weren't changing anything at all. We were in this house for a very long time.
Our boys barely changed the sheets on their bed.
It's very possible, and so I was not prepared for it to take as much of a toll on me. I think the traditional mindset is that other than, me as mom being, tired of just doing all the mom things and all the adulting, that I think the traditional mindset is that the service member is going to come home and have a hard time acclimating. But when he got home, I was really on a level of exhaustion that I don't think I've ever experienced before. And he knew that as well. And so he jumped in like immediately you were giving me supplements. You were like everything that you could to get me back to a better place. And so I'm definitely now at a better place. It was one of those things like, I do remember in the first deployments, you would come home and we used to call it the deployment crud, where like, I don't know if you remember this, but it used to be like, I don't know if this happens to anybody else. But like the service member comes home and they bring some kind of cold or sickness or something with them.
Why wouldn't you want a foreign virus?
Virus.
Every time you go away to a different country.
That's not as funny as it used to be.
Whoopsie.
But we used to call it like the anybody come if you know what I'm talking about, put it in the chat thread. But it used to be like everybody would kind of catch a cold or whatever. And this time, like the sheer amount of stress I think that was on my body, and just like I had been kind of keeping it together, that once you got home and I relaxed, like then I just got a cold and everything, just because all of that stress released into my body. And I just want to kind of maybe say that to a spouse that's listening right now, that if you are carrying an intense amount of stress, especially during a deployment, your body has this remarkable way of helping you cope through cortisol and adrenaline and all of those stress hormones that help you cope through stressful times. But oftentimes your body will hold on to that as long as possible to get you through that season. And then all of a sudden when relief comes and you finally start getting a good night's sleep and your body recognizes that there is no danger and that the stress has passed, it's almost like it releases all of that it's been holding on to. And whether it's cold sores or colds or catching a virus or just something like that, you might have kind of like that window of just that stress just kind of dumping into your body. And that's definitely what happened to me. So now that I've had a good amount of sleep and I've definitely recovered, but that was, wow, what a lesson that I learned from that process. So I don't know if anybody relates to that after having a year of COVID and dealing with kids, or maybe there's somebody listening that relates to the fact that you have had seasons in your family and in your marriage where maybe the kids were really struggling, and it was kind of this intentional, like you don't want to put your marriage on the back burner,
Mhm.
but like your kids are really needing some intense focus for a certain season. And that's really, really hard. We can definitely
Mhm.
validate it's really hard to navigate that as a couple, and try to balance all of that. So definitely, Emily, my back gave out the day my husband came home from his last deployment.
Mhm.
What a great example. Like it's like, what a time to get an injury, right? It's really fascinating. And if you can be self-aware, all of you just more self-aware of what your body is doing and feeling, and
Mhm.
what happens in the timing of it, you'll learn a lot about yourself. And definitely I'm grateful for how the body functions and helps us get through those tough times,
Mhm.
for sure.
Yeah, the body steps up, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're done.
Yep, we give up. We give up. Okay. So otherwise, post reintegration, I think there's this point where it's like, okay, it's this evaluating of what was working for us individually, and what do we keep and what do we let go of, what do we assimilate and bring into our kind of married life. I know I shared during other videos, one of the things Matt was able to do during his downtime was
Mhm.
you really were able to get into nutrition and
Mhm.
exercise more than I think you've ever had before,
Mhm.
in a very like you were able to detail and really, I don't want to say you controlled your food because you didn't have access to a
I
ton
just
of
ate
food.
chicken and lettuce. Let's just
Lettuce.
be honest. I just ate chicken and
He ate
lettuce.
lettuce for 6 months
Well,
straight.
sometimes I ate lettuce and chicken.
But he used his time away to set that goal for yourself. That
Mhm.
was, something that you could do. And I know that's very common for service members to set physical goals or physical training goals. And so he was able to really dial in his nutrition in a way that he had never had before. And I was kind of doing the best that I could under the stress that I had.
Mhm.
And so you coming home, you've
Mhm.
tried to keep that as not, you've eaten more than lettuce and
Oh
chicken,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but
Of
you've,
course.
but you've
Now
definitely,
you have options. Yeah.
which is hard, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So you've really tried to keep that progress that you had made as much as possible. So why
Mhm.
don't you share what it's been like for you to come home and try to keep those goals, or keep reaching, continuing that goal as well now being
I
home?
think the key to all of it is to lean in and be intentional when you can. When you have that moment of like during the deployment, and you can. It's easy. It's easier on a deployment. I have this little fidget. I have a little Captain
Has to
America.
fidget.
I have to have a little fidget when things are like rough. It's not hard to make it just a little more rough. Where you're like, well, this kind of sucks, so let's make it suck a little bit worse.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, and so it's easy to accept that because you're at that place. To be kind of self denial because you're already having to deny things to yourself, and then coming home, you've got to be more graceful with yourself, and you get back into this area of going, okay, no, I can have that piece of cake, and that'll be fine, that'll be good. I'll invite that into my life, and I'll enjoy it. Um, so really, I think with any of it, moving through reintegration on multiple things, not just fitness or nutrition, is the ability to be graceful with yourself, to earn it where you can, and then to be graceful when you can't. And as long as it's if 3 steps forward and 1 step back, and 3 steps forward and 1 step back, as long as you're inching your way to whatever your goal you have, that's good. We had on the second deployment, we were in a really very tired spot prior to the
Mhm.
deployment. We had been running retreats and leading chapel. I think the tally was we had worked 16 weeks straight
Mhm.
prior to the deployment. And I mean weeks. I mean, I was working Saturdays and Sundays. And I mean, so I was basically like deployed at home before even getting deployed. And so we shared this early on. We had our little mottos of, go team, and it was get better every day and
Make it
then make
count.
it count. And so for this deployment, every day it was just, I would make goals, set goals, achieve goals, and then I'd look at myself in the mirror and just say, hey, keep going. Just keep going, because it's just just putting one foot in front of the other, just one step at a time. And if you can do that, whether you're trying to survive a deployment right now, or you're trying to move through reintegration, or you're balancing young kids or teenagers or older parents, whatever it is, keep going. I love the Winston Churchill quote says, if you're going through hell, keep going. And to not judge yourself for the rate of progress that you are or are not making. If you're making progress, that's great. Every little win is a win, and take that where you can get them. Kids sleeping past the 45-minute mark. Hey, that's a win. Take it where you can get it. And then wait until those times where you can actually kind of broaden your range fans and see a little bit further and be able to plan a little bit further. But I would say more than anything, it's, I've had to be graceful with myself and enjoy that and allow myself to enjoy that. But at the same time, keep going.
So first of all, when he said, putting one foot in front of the other and just keep going, one of the thoughts that I had is, I think we as spouses tend to, we're definitely putting one foot in front of the other as best as we can. But my thought was, it's amazing how a lot of times we're both saying that same thing, but in different ways and in different circumstances in our different worlds, and how putting one foot in front of the other might mean something different to the other. Right. And so one of the things we always say is, please don't use, especially this time during reintegration and new normal, to compare your levels of suffering that you experience. There is no comparison. And spouses, I'm specifically talking to you because I think that sometimes we minimize our experiences because, well, we say to ourselves, well, I wasn't without the family, or I didn't go through losing a battle buddy, or I didn't go through a life or death situation like they did. And so how, yes, it took everything in me to get through that moment, that day, or to deal with the kids on that level or whatever. But somehow we minimize that and go, well, it doesn't compare to what he went through. And so I'm just not going to say anything at all. And we just would encourage you to not compare the two, that both of you had your own experiences. They're both very valid. And it's really about, how do you own those, respect each other's, and be able to listen to each other and be able to actually learn from each other, but they both are valid. So the other thing that I want to say is, and I wonder if, put in the chat if this is something that you guys have experienced before. I'm pretty sure it is, but from a spouse perspective, we tend to pick up coping skills at home, or maybe behaviors or routines or something like that helps us get through that time apart. And you may not even realize that you've picked up something until your spouse comes home, and then you're struggling to do it or keep it going in a consistent way. So I've heard some people, some friends of mine, we talk all the time about how when we lived on the installation, especially before social media, when the guys were gone, and I'm using stereotypes here because I know that there's female service members as well, but at that time when the guys were gone on our block, we all did life together, and we did potlucks together, and we went to each other's house and shared, helped with kids and shared food. And it was a huge part of our support network to do that. And then when the guys got home, and they didn't all get home at the same time, but when they did, one by one, everybody kind of just went back in their house, and we didn't see them for months. And I remember some of us would get together and we'd say oh, I just want to go knock on her door and say hi. I haven't seen her for so long, but we don't want to interrupt family time. And so my point here is that sometimes we have these wonderful the positive coping mechanisms that we pick up in order to get through that time apart. And then we start kind of putting them away, or not continuing them, or sacrificing them when our service member comes home. And what the spouses in that kind of block circle we're talking about is, how do we do that? How do we still say to our spouse that we really need friend time? We need alone time with our girlfriends. We still need those walks that we were having, or those play groups that we were having. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't want to be at home and with our husband or our spouse as well. It's just that we need both of those things still. And so for me in this last deployment, I think I shared in one of the other videos, strangely enough, I picked up the cello as kind of my coping and hobby, and Matt encouraged it, and I was thinking about it, and finally he just pulled the trigger and rented it for me. And so
it's just easier if I just buy stuff and just have it shipped to the house, because then she's like, I guess I'll do it.
Yeah. But it's something I've always wanted to do. And so I thought, you know what, this will give me something to do if I am stuck in the house, to really just give an hour a day to practicing that. And so it really became this thing that I looked forward to each day, to sit down and practice that. And it was just for me, and it was just mine, and it wasn't for anybody else. And I was really enjoying that. And then once you got home, I really started to struggle with like, oh, I really want to go practice, but you're home now and I don't want to like go do that because I probably should be spending time with you. And so again, it comes down to what are those coping skills, those things that you picked up that were positive during that time apart that really you found it was a good contribution to your own mental health. And then do you find yourself sacrificing those things or losing traction in those things in the effort to find the balance?
Yeah, because I think, are you looking at the?
I'm looking at the questions while you're talking.
Well, one of the things I want to add to that was on the deployment, the service members have downtime. And when you've got downtime, you're usually watching a movie by yourself, or you're playing a video game by yourself. Maybe you're out working out. So you have that time by yourself most of the time. And so when you come back and you're trying to plug in at work, you're trying to plug in at home, you lose that time by yourself. And so it's been nice that you've got something that's yours, that's your hobby, your joy, that feeds you, and you're a better person after you do it. That kind of that definitely gives permission for me to go, okay, so now is a time where we're not trying to plug in and be, connected. And I could maybe plug in with the boys and do life, and or I could just watch a movie, or I could go play drums by myself and just kind of do that. And it gives us that permission to not be enmeshed, and that's one of the things. It's a good word. Thanks. I brought that up. You're welcome.
Define what that means.
Enmeshed is where you're like overly connected, where you can't really tell the difference between where you start and I stop, and it really, it's like there's no differentiation. And enmeshment can actually take away chemistry in a relationship, because there's no difference there. You're like on top of one another, breathing each other's air, and you can feel that intensity of wanting that. After a deployment, you're like, you've been gone and I just need to know that you're there and you're real. But then if that keeps going on, because you're trying to go, okay, how do we make up for those 6, 9, 12, 15 months
and reestablish connection?
Yeah. How do we find our space again? Where do we find our orbit around one another? You can become enmeshed and not have that differentiation and lose that chemistry between two people. And so you've got to not overdo it. And one thing, when you were talking earlier about not comparing, is also in that comparison, like if it just happens to come up in your heart, to not attack out of it. If you're not feeling understood, to not go, oh, well, here's something, and then just throw that, grenade over at your spouse. And because you're not going to be able to stand, I'm not going to be able to understand. And what I've just basically done is just, thrown,
the shame of that.
Yeah. It's a trump card that nobody can come back from. Right.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it automatically says, go away, you go over there. You can't understand me. You can't be near me. And it creates that separation, when in the midst of it, what you're really wanting is to be understood, to be connected. And you want the other person to go, okay, I see you. I totally understand that. Wow. I didn't realize how hard that was, or you experienced that. You don't even have to feel that for the other person to the depth that they feel it. You just have to acknowledge it, hold it as sacred, and respect it, and work around it. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. It actually brings up a really great point of, this time period after that initial reintegration, I think, is probably the times when some of the stories start coming out, when we start having those harder conversations, and where it can feel like it's really easy to get into those opportunities for conflict and comparison. And because you are starting to look back on your time and go, man, that was really hard. I can't believe what I just did. Can't believe what I just went through. Did that really happen? And it gets really easy to engage in conflict in that way and kind of throw that in your spouse's face, like you're saying, in effort to be seen, to feel like my spouse sees the fact that I went through something really difficult. And instead, I think what we found from the very first deployment was we found this, we personally kind of used this lingo where where, in fact, you were the one that brought it up first, where you said, you know what he had gone through, he was trying to describe what he had gone through during that first deployment, which he struggled far more and went through far more than I had. Not comparison, but like he came home really depleted and really needing to rest. But in his effort to describe it and have me respect it and see him in it, used the phrase sacred space. And he said, you know, I really just need you to respect that space, this thing that I went through. And it's okay that you don't understand it. It's okay that you weren't there for it. I just really need you to tread lightly with it because I'm still processing it. And it was significant. It takes up a significant amount of space in my story now. And so when I start talking about it, if you could just tread lightly, it's kind of sacred to me. And that became a terminology that he and I started to use. And I was able to use it too, to go, this situation that I went through, that was a sacred space for me. Like there's no way, it's okay that you don't understand it, that you weren't there for it. It's just how I navigated through it. And here's what I learned from it, but I'm still processing it. It takes up significant space in my story now. So that was really helpful for us. And so as you kind of get to this place of new normal, and you start looking back on your time and starting to realize what you actually went through and what was difficult and challenging and how you grew, perhaps there's a sacred space in there that you've got to articulate to your spouse, because they can't assume what's a sacred space and what's not.
Yeah. And that leads into, do you want to go to
Yes.
Perfect segue into what we put together for the handout the other day, talking about like, where are we and where are we going and how do we get there? And for people that have, you know, gone through like professional military education and done, you know, we call it Army design methodology. It really just kind of comes down to like, if we're going to define, there's defining the problem, but one of the design methodologies is like, you know, where are we? Where do we need to go, and how do we get there, and what are the obstacles, you know, and what do we need in order to get there? So you're able to kind of quickly, easily define that. And so we revamped that same concept for the handout. Is that what you're sharing?
Yep. I'm sharing with you guys now. And by the way, we are definitely going to be taking your questions tonight. We are going to, like, we already have some that you registered. When you registered, you put in those questions. I can still see the chat. And so if you do have questions or want to give us some feedback in case any of this is relating to your life, we'd love to hear about that as well. Because we have a feeling that what we're going through is something that you've probably experienced too. And so share with us a little bit kind of what your thoughts are in the chat. So I'm sharing with you the listening guide that we gave you. And more than going through it like step by step, what we really want to do is kind of share with you how you can have a different kind of conversation with your spouse to kind of set the course for now that we've looked back and kind of, or how do we look back and think through what we've learned and what we've picked up. What are we going to keep with us as a couple? What are we going to put away? We talk about pickups and put downs. So what are we going to pick up and keep with us and adopt as a couple moving forward? And maybe what are some of the things that we maybe need to let go of, and maybe they were destructive and not helpful, and what are we going to do with that as a couple as well? So your listening guide is more than anything a worksheet for you to be able to sit down with your spouse. Maybe you guys fill it out separately and then you come back together and talk about it. But walking you through these questions that will help you generate this vision casting forward. So the two biggest questions we're asking are, where are we right now? And then where are we going from here? I mean, that's how we could sum it up for sure.
Yeah.
So do you want to kind of go through the where are we, kind of walk through some of the questions and why we're kind of asking those questions.
Okay, so where are we? It's when you were mentioning sacred spaces, that's why it kind of triggered that in my brain of, you have to look at the events. And sometimes we go through events, especially if we're overwhelmed or we're just keep trucking and moving along. You don't actually stop to take stock of it. So one thing that benefited us in the process this time for this deployment was the journal that we used.
Yeah.
And I even tried to print it out, and it's like,
a lot.
800 pages printed. So I'm like debating on, are we going to print this or not? And so going through that journal made us on a daily basis analyze, like, where are we at? What did I experience in that moment? To be able to relay that to one another so we don't have to do this massive catch up at the end. And so we kind of knew who we were walking back in on when we reintegrated, which is so crucial. So if you're in the middle of a deployment, it's not too late to start figuring out, what have I experienced up to this point? How do I share that in depth with my spouse? And we found that that online journal where it just hides in the cloud was the easiest way, because I know some of you don't have that quick, easy access all the time. You may not be able to do video conferencing and calling on the phone, but to at least be able to say, this is what I experienced. This is how I felt about it. And this is the kind of the new me. So take a look. It's not just what did I go through and how did I cope with it? And then the other question that we have on the sheet is, how did it shift your perspective of life and others?
So important.
And even of yourself. I remember on the first deployment, I came home and you had become very decisive because you had 2 young kids and you had to be very decisive. Flip that, when I was in Afghanistan, all of my travel, revolved around rotary wing assets, about helicopters, but rotary wing assets. And so, depending on the weather, depending on the mechanics and fixing the flights and everything, on a day you thought you might travel, you may not. And so you just kind of were like, okay, well, whatever, roll with the punches. We'll see what happens. It's unpredictable and you're just kind of in a reaction. So there's very little you have control over. So we came back together as 2 very different people than we were when I left. So we had to go, okay, I like the way that it made you more decisive, because I had decision fatigue coming home before the deployment. When you were always asking me, should we do this? Should we do that? I was like, well, look, I'm making decisions all day, every day at work. I can't make all these decisions for you. So it was a great relief to me. So that's an instance of that was really good.
Yeah.
And the other part was I came home and you had a lot of stored up anger for the right reasons. It's, everybody gets resentful after a while, bring my service member home now.
Yeah.
That's legit. Right.
Yes.
And so it was actually trying to go, okay, so how do we pump the brakes? So the pickup of you're more decisive. Great. Absolutely on board. The put down of like, okay, but we got a lot of resentment and anger. How can we deal with that in a healthy way, attend to it, validate it, normalize it, and then kind of diffuse it?
Well, it's such a great example. And so I know there's somebody listening that relates to that. And so in a lot of ways, the decisiveness of having to make those decisions when you're around kids all the time, and you just kind of need sanity, right? And so you create structure and routines, and those things become very definite because it determines whether or not you go to bed feeling sane or not, right? And so I became decisive for sure. But I think that a lot of the resentment and the anger came from weariness. It came from exhaustion. And so I think that, for a lot, in fact, I was in Oregon about a week and a half ago, and I mentioned how I'm seeing within the culture for spouses, especially, this level of weariness that's more than I've ever seen. And when I mentioned that, a spouse came up to me later and said, as soon as you said that word weary, I burst into tears. And I didn't even realize how weary I was until you said it. And so I think that what a lot of times happens is there's this exhaustion, and you're anticipating, the deployment or that separation ending, and then it ends, and then it's not easy. Reintegration's not easy. The kids are adjusting. You're adjusting. We're trying to get this new normal. There may be conflict comes in. There's all these things, and it's not easy. And so I think that in that weariness, it's like, why wasn't it easy? Like, I don't want to go through something else that's hard. And so in that weariness comes resentment and anger and all of that. And so when we come to like, how did it shift your perspective of life and others? I definitely went through a perspective shift of a lot of things. And so I'd love to know if somebody's is willing to be vulnerable with this. I would love to see in the chat if you went through a time of separation or a deployment and it shifted your perspective somehow of others. And that could be like just the world and people. Like maybe there was a shift in a positive way, right? Where it's like community stepped in like you've never seen before. And you could not have gotten through what you went through without the help of community. That shifted your perspective of the importance of friends and community and neighbors and doing life with other people. That's a good example. So share, maybe if you're willing, I know it's a vulnerable question, if you've been through something like that where it shifted your perspective. That's so important for you to write down and then share with your spouse, because it shows a kind of growth that's happened in you. It shares And that's what we hear from couples all the time. I feel like somebody's growing without me, or I'm growing more than they are. And that may not necessarily be true. It's just whether or not we're sharing how we grew and how our perspectives shifted over time.
Yeah.
So we've given you those questions, and then this whole idea of how do you incorporate moving forward. Okay. So this is where, and I love that you came up with this terminology of opportunity versus obstacle. So basically, kind of, we've shared this a little bit already, but it's basically taking what did shift for you, how you did change or not, what those experiences that you went through that were really meaningful for you, those coping skills that you adopted, which of those were positive, like the cello is something that I want to continue to work on. That's a positive coping skill that he's also okay with. So therefore, it's an opportunity to incorporate that in our new normal moving forward. That's something that we both agree, like, hey, I love the fact that you picked that up. I love the progress that you're making and how happy that makes you. I'm great with you keeping that in your world. And likewise, I want him to feel like he can continue to make the strides that he wants to, not only in nutrition and in health. I definitely want that to be influenced with me. And so I'm supporting him and doing that with him. But that's not something that I want him to feel like he needs to abandon or give up or sacrifice. And so that's an opportunity for us to kind of get in sync. And it may mean I have to work a little bit harder to kind of catch up to where he is, or kind of get in sync with where he's at. But it's an opportunity for us to vision cast together. That is going to be a part of both of our worlds, not just one person's world.
Yeah.
And so that would be an opportunity. Okay. So then you've also got obstacles. You want to share a little bit on the obstacle side? What would be an obstacle?
I was just looking over the chat.
Okay.
I was so listening to you, and then I was going to look at the chat, and then you asked me a question. I was like, what are
Okay.
you ready?
Well, how about you keep reading the chat and I'll cover obstacles. You want to do that?
Oh, well, I can cover obstacles.
Okay, go. Great.
Obstacles are those things that actually came up that are maladaptive coping mechanisms. And when I say maladaptive, it's like, this thing is not going to get you to where you want to go. Okay. And some of those could be like, if I'll just say it, if you're picking up tobacco use during the course of a deployment, just to be able to deal with nerves and that sort of thing. And it's not something you had before you deployed, or it's not something that you and your spouse have agreed on, that's an okay thing. And you come back in and your spouse is like, wait, what the heck, when did this happen? And you're trying to figure out, how do I incorporate this into my life? It could be some people, I'll just say it, service members can spend a lot of their downtime video gaming. And that's great. I video game with both the boys. We pick up a new game like every couple of months. They teach it to me. We get awesome at it. We beat the boss. We find another game. And it's just the way that we connect. It's the little kind of the world, but I don't allow it to take over their life or my life. And I don't, if it's ever, we keep an open dialogue of, how you feel about it, what your perspective is. And so
when it might become an obstacle versus an opportunity for you to connect with the boys. Yeah.
An obstacle is something that you're using that is not agreed upon within the relationship, that you're not both okay with. It is actually moving your energy direct out of the relationship instead of towards the relationship. Instead of into the family, it's moving you out of the family. And so, what do you think? What from your perspective, what are some obstacles that could be for a spouse?
The first thing I'm thinking about, I hate to say it, is alcohol.
Yeah.
I think it's all too common in our culture that deployments and times of separation are very stressful. And when you are at home, especially if you have kids and jobs and all those other kind of stressors, too common in our spouse culture. It's like, well, what's your drink of choice? Or let's get together with friends and have a drink, or it's been a hard day, so let's have a drink. And so you may not realize over the course of that time of separation, either how much that kind of crept into your life and started to build over time. Or I had a good friend of mine one time say that she decided to stop drinking because she realized this kind of casual glass of wine turned into a nightly nightcap, and that kind of uncomfortable feeling of like, this is turning into an every night sort of thing. And so one of the things that I did during the deployment that was really helpful this time around for me, I am definitely a lightweight, like I can maybe have one drink and that's all. But one of the things that I had to do during the deployment is I knew it was going to be hard, especially during COVID and the stressors of the boys in and out of school. And I knew that was going to be stressful. And so I had just made a choice for the most part to not have alcohol in the house at all, because I knew every day was going to be a stressful day. And I think that can become an obstacle if you are, if it's become a habit and it becomes destructive. And especially if you as a couple are not in sync with that, and you've got to be able to have that accountability towards each other of talking about, like, who are we going to be as a couple together? Who are we going to be to our kids? And this is not about, alcohol is right or wrong and bad or whatever. That's not what this is about. This is about looking at what are those coping skills that you've invited into your world over the time that you've been apart. And let's also be honest with the fact that when we are apart, our main accountability person is not there, right? And so it might be easier to have that second drink. It might be easier to kind of bring in some of those destructive choices. I'm sure on more than one occasion, I had way too much popcorn, for sure. That if you would have been here, you would have been like, you're going to be so sick if you don't stop, right? I know that's silly for me to say that, but honestly, guys, your main person, if they're not there to be your accountability, and they should be, a healthy relationship involves that level of accountability. It's very easy for destructive habits to creep in. And then, talking about new normal and having these tough conversations together, it is really hard to have those conversations of, what do we want to change? What do we want to adjust? And do we, is it food that's become an issue? Is it alcohol that's become, or video games have become an issue? I know that's hard to talk about as a couple, but if we're going to establish this new normal moving forward of what is our marriage going to be and our family going to be moving forward, then we got to figure out how to be in sync and not just go, you know what, I'm going to stay in my lane, you stay in yours. I found what works for me. You found what works for you. And we just will turn a blind eye to each other. That's not necessarily a healthy way to move forward.
No, I was reading one of the chat things.
Yeah. So in just a few minutes, we're going to have time for more. So just questions. And so it doesn't have to even be questions on this particularly. We'll take questions for anything. Just really quick. We won't camp out for this for too long because we want to get to your questions. But this is kind of your last page of that guide that we walked you through. Once you kind of get to this place of where are we and now where do we want to go, and assessing those kind of obstacles and opportunities, we wanted to help you kind of vision cast moving forward. How do you really get to where you want to go, or at least get on a trajectory to get there?
Yeah. So one of the starting points for that is, who is where you want to be, and being able to pick their brain for how did they get there. And one of the first things easily came into mind is mentoring couples. We talk professionally all the time about having mentors. And oftentimes that can usually lead to, okay, I want to get to that rank, or I want to get to that job that you got. How do I get there? Which isn't really the essence of mentoring. Mentoring should be about, how do I become a better person? How do I actually become the fullness of me as an individual and what I was created to be? That essentially should be what it is. But having mentoring couples is paramount, because they can validate the struggles that you're currently in. Usually having a mentoring couple that's at least a decade ahead of you, and at least in the next season of life, at least not maybe even 2 seasons of life ahead of you, that gives you that encouragement of going, if they've got kids at college and you've got, tiny ones at home, to be able to say, hey, you're going to survive this. And here's what I did that worked. Here's what I did that I wish I would have done differently. And so they can advise that on parenting. They can be your sounding board for, hey, I'm struggling with this, and I'm thinking in 5-meter increments, because sometimes you're just engaging little 5-meter targets, and they're able to go, okay, here's what the long story looks like. And so for us, one of the couples that we've actually just kind of been watching from afar, Jeff and Lori Hawkins, he just retired as a chaplain last year, 2 years ago. And just to see how they've moved into retirement and the joy that they've had on their face. And sometimes just having a mentoring couple is just being able to say, they've had such an amazing impact on other people. What is it about the nature of them that makes them so awesome? And spoiler alert, didn't even tell you, I learned today, he actually is, he's going to be the endorser. He's going to be an endorser for one of the
That's
denominations.
perfect.
So anyhow, sorry is good news. Couldn't wait. And so you have to look and go, what is it about them that I admire? And then The other question is, why do you want those traits in your marriage? Because sometimes they're going to have traits that you're not going to be able to have simply because you're different people. And that's why I say being the fullness of who you are as a person and as a couple. The things that make us unique as a couple from, other couples is great, and traits for us that we would easily tell people, that's not something I'm sure you may be able to achieve or have, or may not be a trait or characteristic of your relationship. But if you're not asking those questions of mentoring couples and people that you admire, you won't get to know that and invite them to speak that truth into your life. So they don't just tell you how they got to where they got to, but they're able to tell you about who they are and why they got there. So, and that goes into like, how do we get there? And so you came up with those questions.
Yeah. And so how do we get there? And just very briefly, I'm actually going to just camp out on one of the questions, because obviously I think that they speak for themselves as far as now, how do we integrate all this information into not necessarily a plan, unless you're one of those people that likes to write out a plan, but how do you integrate all this information? And maybe looking at bringing in extra support. There's no shame in you going to a clinician or a counselor to navigate if you're having a hard time reintegrating or getting on the same page, or if you're having a hard time with those really tough conversations that might need to be had. A professional can help you not only find your words, but if it's marriage counseling, can help you verbalize those words, be that mediator for that, make sure you guys are hearing each other in a way that's productive. And so, but what I really actually want to camp out on as we close this hour and then move into question and answer is this question about what areas can you compromise or collaborate together? Yeah. And this was something that Matt and I had written down one question and then we decided to adjust it. And really all it comes down to is, again, going back to what are you kind of putting away that you really wish that you could keep in your life because it's a new positive coping skill for you. It's just that reminder of this is not about necessarily sacrificing and putting, the deployment self away and trying to find that person from before and ignore who you've become, right? It's really about like, okay, like this is me now, this is you now. We kind of have some new things about us that we've picked up over time. And so how do we collaborate together to make that happen? It takes a little bit of adjustment. I mean, just for the silly example of like, hey, I think I want to go play the cello. And he's like, sure, go play it. There's a part of me that's like, is he really okay with me playing it? Or is he just saying that? Or, there is that adjustment period of collaborating together to really live it out and actually try it out and see how it goes. And, it would be completely understandable though, if I'm like waiting to practice my cello for every night when he's home and it's now 2 hours every night. And I mean, he has every right to go, okay, this is kind of consuming all of our nights. Is not quite what I thought we meant about you continuing the cello. Is there another way for you to do it where you don't sacrifice it completely, but that we kind of honor that time that we have together too? It might take that adjustment and that conversation and how do we collaborate and kind of make this new normal, like Play-Doh, right? Like just kind of form this as we go and continuing to communicate through it and conversate through it in case we might need to adjust things a little bit along the way.
Yeah, because on the deployment, you're making most of the decisions. I mean, definitely with the boys in mind, and I'm making decisions but you're making decisions for you. Like, what do I want to do in this moment? And you're the adult that weighs in on that, 99.9% of the time. And for me, I'm going, well, if I have the opportunity, what do I want to do in this moment? And then when you come together and you two adults that actually have to go, okay, what do I want to do? What do you want to do?
And how does that impact you?
And so if you're intentional with your planning, if you communicate, this is what's meaningful to me. If you're intentional with your planning so that you set expectation, so you're able to go, hey, look, this amount of time during the week, that's absolutely great. Because I'll plan to do something else. I'll have my own thing, right? And not just like, hey, I'm going to go do this. And you just kind of walk off. That nobody likes that, but growing up and adulting is hard. And one of the things you have to do is you have to organize your calendar and you have to organize your coin purse and figure out where do we put our time? Where do we put our money? How do we invest in that? Because you have to partition those things off well.
So hopefully that was helpful. Definitely something that we're still navigating, especially when you bring kids in the mix of all of that. There's definitely like what's going on with the kids and how do they adjust and kind of form into like what their routines and what they adopted over time as well is all part of that is for sure. So we are going to go into some question and answer. I know we already have one question in the question and answer box. And we also have the questions that you sent in when you registered. So you feel free to throw in more questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box so that we can make sure to get to all of your questions tonight. I love this one that was presented. It's a big question. It's actually like 2 or 3 questions in one, but it's a really tough question, and it's valid though, for sure. So I'm not going to read it because I want to make sure that I honor if there's any anonymity that's there. But the question, which is a common question, is from a spouse perspective, when the service member comes home and they're having trouble reintegrating, and she's wanting him to engage more and be more responsible. He's trying to not have a lot of conflict starting. And so it's kind of like they're not hearing each other. They're kind of like contrasting with each other. And so she's asking about, first of all, if he's spending all this alone time and all this time playing video games and not really connecting into the family, she's still taking on the heavy load of everything that's happening around the house. And the first question, there's a couple in here, but the first question is, it can really bring you to a place when the reintegration is not going well and the new normal is not going well. And like I said before, when it's more stress and more adulting and it's really hard, it's very normal for you to have these kind of internal feelings of, man, it was easier when we were apart. So I want to first just validate that is a normal feeling to have. And it's obviously destructive and hurtful if you say it out loud. But it is normal to have that moment of like, man, it was nice when I had that time to myself and it was quiet, or it was, even though it was hard, there's also these little pieces of it that you kind of looked forward to. And it's small things. It could be, I had control over the household and loaded the dishwasher the way that I wanted to do it, or I ate what I wanted to eat. Ate what I wanted to eat. Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
And so it's a normal feeling to go, man, I think that might've been easier. And so first of all, I would definitely encourage you to not say those things out loud. And if you've said them out loud in conflict, definitely something to go back and just heal that wound and repair that damage that's happened. Because honestly, I don't think we all mean that. It's coming from a place of desiring healthier connection and healthier reintegration and really wanting it to not be harder on the other side. And now we're in a place of conflict with this question, right? Because what she's saying is, I need to confront him on the things that he's doing that feels destructive to me, or at least not helpful or harmful to the reintegration. And I don't want to bring it up because I'm weary. I'm so tired that I'm going to just say it out loud because I hear it all the time. And it was also put in the question, is that from a spouse perspective, it feels like we've taken on another child to manage. So first of all, let me kind of just speak some hard truth, understanding exactly what you're saying as far as why you're saying it. I would encourage you and other spouses that are feeling this way, I would encourage you to, when that feeling comes up, to very quickly arrest that thought. Because as soon as we entertain that thought of it feels like I've got another child in the house, first of all, it's not true, right? You did not marry another child. You married a grown adult. And so you've got to remind yourself that this is not a child. They may or may not be acting like a child. There's just some patterns that we've got to adjust, and there's some confrontations we might need to have and some tough conversations that need to happen. The good news is you've got another adult to do that with. And so be careful to not entertain that for too long. Don't entertain that thought that I've got another child. Instead, remind yourself, arrest that thought and remind yourself, my husband is not a child. They are my husband. They are my spouse. They are my lover. They are my friend. They are my person. It just means we've got to have some tough conversations. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So a couple of things that actually came up to me was, if you feel like your spouse is not being attentive to your needs or attending to something that you need done, first off, you've got to be able to communicate that. So set a time and a place. Never spontaneously surprise somebody. Nobody likes a sneak attack. And so it's to be able to say, hey, I'd love for us to set aside some time this week. What's a good time for you? Just to be able to communicate where we're at and a few things that I want to be able to bring up. Okay. And just put them at ease and go, the reason I'm doing this is so that these aren't a problem. So they aren't underlying issues. So I don't build up resentment, because having that contempt I think it wasn't the Parrots. Who was it? Who does the institute in North Carolina?
Ooh, Rio
No,
Leslie.
no, that's
Oh.
Colorado. The one in North Carolina where they video
I'll have to get back to you on that.
So
Mhm.
yeah, they determine they do this thing where they videotape couples, and they allow them to live in an apartment for a while. Gottman, yeah, John Gottman. So
Just needed more
did
information.
Yeah. So Gottman does this, and what they determined was the number one predictor of relationships failing is resentment and contempt. Number one, hands down. If you see things that are contempt and you start to notice in yourself that you're harboring contempt for your spouse, it's the number one thing that kills relationships. So you have to address what your needs and your wants are, and be able to differentiate between your needs and your wants. And if it's a need that you feel is not getting met, communicate that. And if you feel like you need the help of a professional, go get that. And then the second thing is there a specific way that you need that need to be met and be done? So, for instance, if it is contributing around the house, taking care of household chores or whatnot, and or raising the kids and being back involved as a parent, is there a specific way that you expect that to be done, or are you willing to compromise and collaborate on the way that they're actually trying to weigh in? And here's the thing: is positive reinforcement goes a long way, a lot farther than negative reinforcement. So if the service member is trying or making an attempt and failing valiantly, at least give them the positive response of, okay, I see you're trying. Okay. And here's the thing: if they're coming back into the home and it's young kids and they're not getting good positive reinforcement from the children, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's
to
true.
not have that connection. It is heartbreaking.
Do you think that service members in that heartbreak would hide?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
you hide,
avoid.
You run, you're like, I guess I can't be a good
failing.
parent. I guess I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I'm failing. They don't love me. They're running to you. They don't know me, and they'll start to shame themselves. And so what's difficult in that moment is you could be exceptionally tired as the supporting spouse, needing me to parent. I want to parent in that moment, but in that moment, the children aren't being cooperative. And you've got to be able to encourage me, which is hard because you're exhausted, that I need to keep trying and keep attempting. And then it's the tiny little wins, and so you've got to communicate what I need to do to win with the kids, and not do it for me. And because that comes easy because you've been doing it the whole time.
And I just want to acknowledge that what he's saying sounds exhausting. And I know that there's weary spouses out there that are like, I don't know if I can give anymore. And all I can say to that is you need to read my book, Sacred Spaces, because it really walks through that resentment that when he came home, all that resentment that I had and was struggling with, how I ultimately took a look at that and had to start resolving it, and what does it look like to repair your marriage post-deployment, really? And how do you kind of bring these two these paths together? But can you speak for what if, because this is what they're asking, and I see this other question that popped up, so I did see it pop up and I'm going to address it. Can you answer, what about if that service member is not trying? Like, I think that's what's behind the question is they're not trying. And I just want to say, one of the things that stands out to me the most about your question is there's a phrase that you used in there that says, but I need help.
Yeah.
And that is such a powerful phrase. And it's such a powerful phrase to say to your spouse in that situation.
Right there.
Sometimes the best thing that we can do is be honest in kindness. We did one of these segments, one of the videos that we did on communication. We talked about how to be assertive without being passive aggressive or passive and not being aggressive. And so aggressive would be to storm into that room where they're playing video games and rip that Xbox out of the room and say, no more, right? That's really aggressive. You may want to do it, maybe the right thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be beneficial and get your point across. But to be assertive, to own your need and own your discouragement and own exactly where you're at, and to be able to say in kindness, I am so tired. I need your help. I cannot do this without you. And I feel alone. That's a lot of I statements. it's not a lot of accusation. It's just you kind of owning your truth and kind of standing firm in what you know to be true about yourself and what your need is, and communicating that still in kindness.
Mhm.
So anything you want to say else about that? We'll go to the next question.
You have to say that. I
Yeah.
need help.
I think that's, you actually found your own words. And
Yeah.
so being able to say that is important. Again, going to a professional help you say those words if you
Yeah.
need to. I can't stress that enough.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is similar, but it's actually addressing alcohol, which is, again, a huge issue within our community. It's the drug of choice for our community and our
Yeah.
culture. And so the question is, how do you handle when drinking as a coping is the opposite for your spouse? In other words, it's a service member that is using drinking as their coping skill. And because of the stressors, right? COVID, harder to get outside to do things. And so now some of those things have compounded and stressing your spouse out. And so it sounds like we are drinking more than we need to be.
Right.
Okay. And so how do we address it without the kids feeling like they're suddenly doing a bunch of things wrong or upsetting daddy all the time? I'm trying to understand that.
I think that's bordering alcoholism if it isn't.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, like, we don't have a problem with alcohol in our home. Not that, I mean, I enjoy beer, she enjoys wine, so we're not coming at it from a very like
fundamental conservative place.
But I will say, I've always had a 2-drink maximum rule for myself. And I have a great friend that he said anytime that he feels like he needs to have a drink, he doesn't, specifically because he doesn't want to medicate with that. I call the class 6, it's the non-prescriptive pharmacy, because a lot of people, instead of actually going to see a doctor and getting on medication that would help them deal with trauma, anxiety, depression, any of those things, it's just too easy to avoid that, not have it on your medical record, and then just go on down to the class 6, get something, numb. And really, because it's just numbing and it's escaping. And what you're doing is you're numbing the feeling and you're escaping from a problem that's going to be waiting for you as soon as you sober up. And it's just going to be the next day, you're just going to feel worse. And what it ends up happening is we could be having a difficult time just dealing with teenagers, right? And you're like, hey, let's relax and, kick back a few and we'll feel better, right? But then all of a sudden, the lack of our ability to connect may come out, and we may go, oh, I really miss you, and I wish we went on more dates, and which
our inhibitions are down.
If we are sober, you say, oh, I really wish we went on more dates. I'm like, yeah, me too. But if I'm several beers deep, I'm like, so what? I don't take you out on enough dates? Like, what's the problem? Like, what am I doing?
All the insecurities and fears and lies like surface, and you have no filter. You have no self-control. And so that's just what we have found as we've worked with other couples and in our own life, is that rarely is it really worth it. And you really kind of, the deeper you get into this, the more trouble and destruction starts happening. And so such a valid point. And so I think that, and I want you to be able to answer from maybe a service member perspective, and from a man perspective, a male perspective. But I just want to say, again, going back to those tough conversations, setting boundaries are very hard in relationships and in marriage. And when I work with couples, I would say 99% of the time, the problem, no matter what that problem is coming into the session, it could be drinking, it could be lack of communication, it could be betrayal, it could be any number of things. 99% of the time, the issue at its core root is a lack of shared values. It comes down to, what do we believe that family means? What do we believe marriage means? What do we believe coping means? That's a value. What will we do when we get stressed? And there's a difference of opinion on that. And so this is a values question. This is, what do you value in this moment? Family time and being the best that you can be for your spouse and your family, or do you value the alcohol more, right? What do you, the spouse that was writing this, what do you value more? The peace in the home of keeping quiet and not saying anything at all, or facing conflict until something changes.
Mhm.
That's a value, right?
Yeah.
And so this really does come back to, I hate to say it, but you have to be able to speak your truth and learn to say it in kindness, to be able to say, this boundaries are very healthy in relationships. And it's very important to have those boundaries and know how to say them and set them and hold them. And so being able to say, either I think that you have a drinking problem, or if that feels scary to say, to be able to say that I statement again, to be able to say, this this pattern that we have in our day-to-day life is not working for me.
Yeah.
I'm very worried about you as far as how much you're drinking and how you're coping with the stress in your life. What can I do and who can I be to help you deal with these stressors better? Because you drinking as much as you are is kind of creating some consequences between us and consequences with the family. And I'm starting to feel like I'm walking on eggshells. And I think that we both might need help with this.
Yeah.
I think that it's scary to say, but just kind of root yourself and ground yourself and speak the truth in love. And that's the only way to grow as a couple.
When you speak the truth, it is love, and it may not come across as loving, but it's moving into a difficult place, especially if it's a difficult truth. The willingness to move into a difficult place and have that conversation with another person says, I love you and your betterment and our future together more than I love the comfort of right now. And so so often people actually go through the comfort of right now. I'm just going to try and be comfortable right now. And we're just going to kick that rock down the road and kick it down the road. And it's going to pick up steam. And eventually it becomes a boulder that you're like, how did this become a boulder? Well, we didn't deal with it when it was a pebble because we wanted the comfort of right now. And now it's very uncomfortable to deal with that boulder. But you asked, from a service member perspective, or at least strictly from a male perspective, and you love this, the crayons. So I think we actually were born, most men were born with 4 crayons: mad, sad, glad, and anxious. And if you're sad and anxious, that usually becomes mad. So really it's just glad and mad that you're trying to deal with. And because we don't have that education growing up, because we feel our feelings very deep and we sense them, very deep in our soul. Like if we're mad, we are severely mad. If we're glad, we are having the best time in the world. If we're anxious, we are 3 sheets to the wind. And if we're sad, might as well crawl underneath the table, because we feel those things so deeply, but we don't have words for them. Many men were not allowed to feel them. They were, they were sublimated, they were pushed down. And you weren't able to sit there and go, how do I deal with this very uncomfortable feeling right now? When, especially with stress, work stress, feeling like you're anxious about an evaluation, anxious about a deployment, anxious about a training. How do you deal with that anxiety? How do you sit in the midst of that and just let it be? And when it's a negative thing, too often, like, especially like, let's say you've got a problem and you're telling me about the problem. 9 times out of 10, I'm like, here's how to solve the problem, right? Let's solve this problem, rather than going, what if we just sit in it for a second and allow ourselves to kind of feel it, just to kind of understand it? What if I sat in that with you so you didn't feel alone? It's hard to do that because I am, and I think most men are, problem solvers. So when you have those negative emotions, you're like, well, I got to get rid of this. How am I going to get rid of this negative emotion? I'm going to drink. That's a good thing, because if I do that, I won't feel sad, or I won't feel anxious or mad, or I'll just turn off the prefrontal cortex for a little bit and I'll be better. Right. And so sometimes nothing wrong with that. If it's done in moderation, in safety, if it's agreed upon, if we have shared values. But if it's the constant go-to, you're never really learning how to deal with the uncomfortable emotion. You're never really learning how to sit in that uncomfortable feeling. If you're not plugging back into the family because you're anxious about how you're going to perform within the family or being able to parent again, and you just constantly leave and constantly go to video games and constantly go to something else, you're never growing. You're never learning actually how to become a better human being. And so what happens is you will replicate that in your children. Yeah. And so you'll only have that difficulty later on when you're looking at them going, well, why don't you know how to do that? Well, because you didn't learn how to do it and you didn't teach them. But the great news is there's plenty of people out there that can help you figure that out. You deserve that. You deserve to be able to sit in a place of peace and find it within yourself, to be able to feel a negative emotion, sad, mad, or anxious, and to figure out how to deal with it in a way that isn't destructive, because you're able to control it in the professional environment, especially when you have to maintain your military bearing. But what happens is we turn that control off when we get home. And when you have to stay controlled, overly controlled, the pendulum swings into the other place when you get in at home, and you lose control. And you've got to find that little balance for the pendulum so you can actually kind of stay centered most of the time in your life to be able to sit in that anxiety. Is that all right?
Oh yeah. And speaking of uncomfortable feelings,
Yeah.
I just want to point out from the chat that I know it's hard to say things because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, but a healthy marriage not only has those boundaries, but has healthy accountability and it's a constantly evolving process.
Yeah.
It's never something that you arrive at, but it is really, important over time to learn in your marriage how to have those tough conversations, because they probably should happen more often than not. And of course it's hard when Matt comes to me and says, hey, this is something I'd like for you to change or take a look at. And maybe it hurts my feelings, or maybe it's just uncomfortable. But if it's something that he needs to bring up, he has a right. What we learned in assertiveness in that communication talk is you have a right to your thoughts, feelings, and opinions. And you also have the right to ask someone to change behavior if it feels destructive to you. And so that means he has a right to say it, and I've got to learn how to accept it. Now, neither one of us is perfect. We're not going to get it 100% perfect every time and find the perfect words. That's going to cause the least amount of psychological discomfort to the other person. Sometimes we just have to have grace and hear the root of what they're trying to say, and that we're doing the best that we can. We should always kind of do the best that we can to say it in kindness. But sometimes it is going to hurt someone's feelings, and it's probably the psychological discomfort that they need in order to make a change.
Yeah. One correction. You said that you have to accept it, and I would disagree. I would say you have to be open to hearing it.
Yeah.
Just because I want to be assertive and say, hey, like we had a conversation last night, you're taking jujitsu with Aiden now. And so last night we were like, so how many nights a week is this actually going to be? And we were kind of differentiating between expectation. And I wanted to assertively, I was like, well, this is what I feel like the right number is. And it seemed like you were coming at it from a different angle. And we both had different reasons for why we were approaching that number of,
days a
jiu-jitsu
week.
sessions a week, right? And so we were in an argument. We went to bed angry. We woke up this morning. We're like, hey, I still love you. I'm not sure where we are, as far as agreeing on that. But we both were assertive to say, here's where I'm coming from. We both were open to go, I'm not there yet, but I'm willing to listen. And so assertive grown-up communication is to be able to say, I'm going to speak for myself, and I'm going to say these things for these reasons, not to attack you or defame you or to hurt you personally. And I'm not trying to speak for you. I'm not trying to mind read and say, you're doing this because you don't like me. And it's to say, here's why I'm not comfortable with this. And the other person has the choice to grow up,
to hear it,
to hear it and to go, well. And one of my favorite phrases that I teach people is like, hey, the best response is, I need to take a look at that. Because take a look at it. Taking a look at it says, I'm going to respect your opinion and your perspective. So
good. I know we camped out on that a little bit, but I think it's important. And I think it also covers a lot of what we're talking about tonight, as far as the tough conversations you might need to recalibrate your relationship and get in sync with each other. So this other question that we have, I realized looking back that I kind of read half of one and then the other, and that's why I was confused. But the actual question, as I am understanding it, is that during the deployment, and because of COVID and because everything that was happening, there was routines and structures and things that were allowed in the house or allowed in your life and daily living that you did to survive and to keep the kids occupied and surviving. And you were trying to choose your battles. Totally know what that's like as a mom, especially during a deployment where you're like, you know what? I mean, I have my younger son we tend to clash and tend to fight on things. And I remember during that first deployment, I was like, I have to choose my battles or I'll be fighting all day long.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were some things that I relaxed a little bit on,
Mm-hmm.
and other things that I was like, all right, that's the battle that I'm going to have today. And it was for my sanity and also for the relationship with my child, so that it wasn't contentious all the time. And so when you get into this place of reintegration, that can be kind of surprising to your spouse,
Mm-hmm.
who's like, wait a minute, why are we like allowing these things? Why are we like, this feels like either a lot, or, and I don't know what the actual situation is, but maybe like the home is the playground now, or like things are just kind of feeling more chaotic to the service member, but it worked for you. It worked for you. And so, I think that my way, excuse me, of answering this question,
I have
a little bit of water,
the tiniest,
a tiniest bit.
water.
I think my way of answering this question is, and this is a hard one because, you know, you found something that works for you. And what it feels like to me is that, you know, when Matt comes home from a deployment,
Mm-hmm.
the things that, there's just blind spots that I've just kind of allowed in my day to day, for whatever reason. And suddenly when he's home, he's seeing things that either I'm just choosing to ignore, or
Mm-hmm.
that I've just turned a blind eye to, or that I just don't want to deal with it, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And so he's suddenly seeing those things and it's bringing it to my attention. And there's so many emotions that come with that. I think what's dangerous is,
Mm-hmm.
again, going back to what we said in the very beginning, what's dangerous in your relationship is if you kind of ground yourself in my way and it's going to stay this way because that's what works for us. I think nothing makes the service member feel more on the outside and
Mm-hmm.
not needed and not a member of the family than we say, you know what, you're just going to have to deal with what we've decided to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now that doesn't mean that you go to the other extreme and everything changes, because that can, depending on what we're talking about, that can throw your kids off too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, again, it goes back to this collaboration. It's can I hear from my spouse what this is like for them to reintegrate back into the home with things feeling maybe more chaotic to them?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference in discipline? Is there a difference in parenting? Are they having a hard time kind of joining in on that parenting when this is not something that they feel comfortable with, but it's something that you do? And so that's a difference in parenting styles
Mm-hmm.
and how we view home and family and all that. So I think have those conversations carefully. I think it is be willing to choose your battles with your spouse.
Mm-hmm.
So just the same way that you did with your kids, it's kind of going, all right, what am I willing to give on a little bit and kind of see their perspective and kind of incorporate and kind of say, you know what, maybe it is time to tighten the ship just a little bit. Maybe you sit, depending on the age of your kids, maybe it's you sit down as a family and talk about, okay, now that we're all home and together, what is it going to look like moving forward? Because we might need to change things because COVID is kind of coming to an end and school's going to open up soon, maybe. And so the whole world might be a little bit different right now. So how do we as a family function differently moving forward? And that way everybody is on board.
Yeah. Yeah. And somewhat in that question, I was understanding like, when we were dealing with the boys going through COVID, and because there wasn't access, we were a lot more lenient on screen time. And I don't know if that's what's inside that question, but being graceful with yourself that we haven't ruined an entire generation. And it can become difficult because as adults, we don't understand what the kid experience has been. So there's that. But one of the things, as you were talking, I wanted to, going back to what you were saying with values, is be able to communicate your why. Of if you have a value of a parenting value, being able to communicate why. And sometimes when we can hear not just the what or the how, but if we understand the why, then I think that can help out a lot more. So, yeah.
So good.
Questions.
And we have a few more minutes left. So I'm going to go through the questions that you guys submitted during the registration. Some really, really good questions. I think as far as how to stay connected or reconnect after deployment with no communication, that's really tough. I think ease into that slowly, be very respectful. This is like, I imagine like a Navy couple where he or she's been on a ship and there's really been no communication, or they've been in a remote location. And so I would just say in that reintegration to just ease in slowly, communicate as best as you can, be very graceful with each other. If there's big differences or you feel like you're disconnected, it will come back over time. Think of that time of reintegration as shared experiences. And one of the things we talked about in Sacred Spaces is one of the keys to bringing your marriage back together is to have more shared sacred spaces together that counteract the number of sacred spaces you've had individually. So this time of reintegration, this ability to connect is really about, okay, how do we set the tone for our dates and our time together so that we kind of bring in as many shared sacred moments together. And sacred space moments are built off of multi-sensory experiences that you have together. So maybe you do a date night that is kind of unforgettable, right? Where you go do a food tasting or do a cooking class together. It's multi-sensory. It's one of those things that you're not going to forget, right? Then you create a shared memory that's positive together. And then maybe you're not talking about all the things that you missed during the deployment. Instead, you're talking about that really amazing date night that we had, right? We have more things to talk about from this point forward to kind of fill in the gap of the time that maybe you spent apart. So is it okay if we move to the next one?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. I love this one about how do you as a spouse take a break after coming back? Do you want to share like some of the things you've tried to do for me?
Well, first, as a service member, I have to give you, it's not that you need my permission.
Yeah.
But I have to explicitly say, go take care of yourself. And then I have to make the space and the time for you to do that.
Yeah.
And I have to believe, knowing that I have to believe you're probably exhausted, that it's okay, to know that it's going to be difficult for you to do that. To know that, especially if, back when we had young kids, that I had to be up to speed on what all was going on with the kids. Like, what's their favorite Transformer? Like, what's going to keep them from crying? What do they eat? Love to eat. They get dad meals, which is Totino's pizzas and chicken nuggets. In case you were wondering, just 2 Totino's pizzas, sprinkled chicken nuggets.
Win for dad.
Win for dad. And,
heaven forbid you add a can of green beans.
Who needs green beans?
Which I tried and failed.
Oh my gosh, she introduced.
We got to stay on topic though.
So I have to know that. I have to explicitly tell you, go take a break, go take care of yourself. And sometimes that's legitimately saying, hey, by the way, I already bought the hotel room. So haha, we can't take it back. If you don't go, you're the one wasting that money.
Yeah, he has done that. We tried to do that after this deployment, and a lot of the things we tried got sabotaged for a variety of reasons. Yeah. I did have a speaking engagement in Oregon where I did have that whole weekend actually to myself in a room by myself, and I knew that's what I needed. And so coming back from that, I think I really reached that place of feeling restored because I could just be in my own space and sleep as much as I needed to sleep and take care of myself that way. So I think if your spouse isn't like offering it, then you got to ask for it. You just really have to ask for it. And whether that's like going for a walk or a run, or whether that's going for a night in a hotel room by yourself, please take care of yourself and communicate what that looks like. And don't ask them to guess that.
I think the next one, rekindling the love and keep things fun and exciting. I think that could be Esther Perel.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So one resource that's like really just blowing up, that's great, that we're using is Rekindling Love, Rekindling Desire by Esther Perel. And it's one of those places where it's actually like walks you really through. It's not just about sex and sensuality. It really is about like, how do you actually sit back and be comfortable in your own skin? And I remember you saying when we had young kids, like you get to this point where you're just like, just quit, mom. Yeah. It's all the little touching. And at some point you're like, could everybody not need me for just a moment? So you could have yourself back. One thing that's hard for military couples or for families that have kids is that you're constantly feel like you're needed and you're relied on. And to be able to sit in your own skin, have your own autonomy, your own agency.
And also learning the communication again with your spouse. She just does a really good job of helping you understand desire and how to get that desire back. And so we would definitely recommend that. And I will make sure to adjust the listening guide to reflect that link as well. Cool. So very good. Okay. We might go 5 minutes over, Laura, but there's some great questions here to address.
So how do I strengthen a marriage after 15 years?
I think that's kind of the same.
Yep. Okay.
I think I do want to answer this question about this is and I can answer this one quickly. As far as there's a family that newly came in to being in the military, and so your kids are really struggling with that. First of all, I would say we did a parenting series. I think it was in January. Be sure to listen to that. And also just understand that kids are going to go through a variety of feelings, whether you are on the other side of deployment or whether you've made a new decision coming to the military. And they have a right, like they have a right to have their own thoughts, feelings, and opinions about what's happening to them, right? And so giving them voice to that and giving them space to share their frustration is so valid and important for them to learn how to share their feelings about that. In one of the previous webinars we did, I think it was one on communication where I shared the 5-minute check-in with a feelings wheel. I cannot even stress to you how helpful this is to walk teens through the feelings wheel and that 5-minute check-in to help them learn how to communicate their feelings. Great for you guys in your marriage as well, to be able to talk about those tough things. And so vision casting, I think, is what is important here. And this is not a political statement at all, but I just want to share that one of my favorite quotes was from George Bush's Decision Points book. It's really helped me as we've navigated this military lifestyle. There's a part in his story where he talks about how he was the governor of Texas and he was thinking about running for president. And his daughter was a teenager at the time, came to him on the back porch and she begged him, please don't run for president. Please don't do this. This is not something that we want to go through. We're going to be dragged through the mud and through the press and all of that. And we're asking you not to do it. And I loved his answer because he definitely is a family person and values his kids. But his answer was, it was something along the lines of, your mother and I have a calling that is on our life. And it's something that we have to honor that calling and do the best that we can with what's been given us and make the best decisions that we can with what we are being asked to do with our life as a couple. And the best that we can do is honor that and be a model for you, because someday you're going to have your calling and tough decisions that you're going to have to make. And your kids are going to struggle with that too. But he listened to his daughter, but he also cast vision to say, I know this is going to be hard, but if I don't say yes to this, here's the consequences, or here's what could happen in our life. And maybe that's just, I won't feel like I'm living out the calling that's on my heart. And so sometimes casting vision for your kids is one of the best things that you can do. So, we already talked about how you can access the previous webinar as far as the other episodes, if you will. These last two questions I think are good. Advice on how to best discuss different military-related topics with family members who may not understand or may not have experienced military life. So hard. Do you want to go into that, or you want me to answer it?
I don't. If you don't have the same context or frame of reference, it makes it all but impossible.
I think that I would say that too. And that's okay.
It's really difficult. The more that we've actually tried to describe it, words fall short. There's a blog I wrote back in 2013 when I was about to go attend Medal of Honor ceremony for one of my soldiers. And there was a part that I remember writing in there, and I had heard from somewhere else. So I'm paraphrasing, quote, and it said, for those that know, no words are needed. For those that don't, no words will do. And it really is kind of the point where, we all have our sacred spaces within our different branches, within our different experiences, and sometimes you just have to have that person. So for instance, I will say this, I know you're going over. Today, I'm, assisting in preparing a memorial ceremony. And the first sergeant walks up to me and we start comparing notes of where we've been. And it turns out he was in my first assignment. He was in a sister battalion. And we started talking about who we knew and who he ran with. And he ran with some of the guys out of my squadron. And we started talking, and the rest of the world dissolves away, just absolutely dissolves away. And then we tried to communicate to some other person, who we were, 4th Brigade, Mountain Warriors, and what you knew about, back then, Colonel George and all the leaders. And the more you talk, the more you're like, nobody's ever going to get that. And that's a very, very small microcosm. But I mean, when you talk about the military at large, it really is hard. But here's the other thing, like, I think it gives you that much more voice to go to the next question, to talk life and to speak life into people in the military.
Yeah.
Because you're doing it with them. There's this person, said that after 20 years, they still have days of struggle. We just told you we argued last night. We still have days of struggle.
And it's about bringing purpose from that.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfect. It's not about having arrived. It's not, your relationships and your life need to be more about repair than perfection.
Exactly.
And so out of that repair of repairing myself and restoring myself after a difficult deployment or a difficult week, I've got to learn how to get better and better at repairing and restoring myself, or engaging in repair and restoring with him. And out of the confidence of our ability to repair when we need to repair things comes our ability to serve you and to invest and bring purpose from our struggle. Because if that's really hard to go through all these struggles. Life is really hard, but you bring an aspect of joy and peace to your relationship when you realize that you can take that struggle and bring something good out of it.
Henry Nouwen would say, out of our greatest woundings comes our greatest ability to provide healing in the life of another, because you actually know what that looks like. You know what it takes. You have the experience. I mean, you may have the head knowledge, but you got that heart, gut knowledge. And so I think it's extremely valuable to bring that to bear. And so wrap this all up.
Yeah.
The reason we want to pour into your marriage and encourage you and your family is because we know that this doesn't just stop with us, that there's people out there that are watching, that they're going to go through something difficult. They're going to overcome, and then they're going to turn around and pour that into somebody else's life. Why? Because this whole community is going to keep going long after we're here. I mean, long after we're way gone, right? So it's taking what you're learning now, apply it to your marriage, gain mastery over it, and then pour that into somebody else, so that the thing you're struggling with now becomes the thing you point back to later on and said, that's when it was dark, and that's when it was painful, and that's when the hurt was. But we overcame, we got mastery over it. And that doesn't tell us who we are right now. It doesn't define us. And that's how you add value. And so I want to close with this quote from the book that I've always said. April 10th, 2010, I wrote this from Afghanistan. Only those things for which a price has been paid have lasting value and true worth. And that's our hope for you, is that you pay a really good, deep price to do the hard work in your relationship, individually and together and with your family. And by that, you actually give lasting value and true worth to this marriage that didn't have value when you first began it. And the more you go through it, the more you have those sacred spaces, those shared moments, those struggling times, that you come out on the other side winning and kicking tail. That's when you have something that you have to protect, and it becomes a priceless gem.
So thank you guys so much for joining us for this series for tonight. Especially thank you for your patience as we went over just a little bit, having a little bit of a hard time closing things down because we love you so much. But it's been an honor to serve you. Thank you for kind of being very careful and protective of our time going through this time and sharing it with you. We've really learned a lot, and we've enjoyed sharing it with you. And so, Laura, thank you so much for your amazing team. You and Trish have been amazing throughout this series as well. You've worked with me each week. We've talked through, we've loved everybody, and just anticipated every month doing this again. And so you guys have been an amazing team to work with. So thank you.